All right, everybody, welcome back. This is the beginning of chapter 24, the New Deal. We are kind of turning that corner, starting to head for the finish line. So that's a good feeling as we kind of finish up here with the New Deal and get into that next test and, then get started in World War II. So we're getting closer to finished, and, that's a good thing. So um, the New Deal is the response to the Great Depression. And this chapter really kind of treats it that way as, the Great Depression happens and it talks about the social and cultural effects and everything in chapter 23. Um, Chapter 24 is largely political and generally the response from President Roosevelt to the problems of that the country's facing with the depression, and that's kind of basically the stuff we're going to really look at here in chapter 24. Lots of programs and kind of politically motivated things, and also a little bit about Roosevelt as president. So, before we continue, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to my channel. Hopefully, you'll like the exclusive content we have here as we get ready for that AP exam coming up in just over 2 months. So, let's get right to it. All right, so I want to take a look at, just to give you an idea of how bad the Depression got, how quickly. This is nominal GDP from 1920 to 1940. This number is kind of like the gold number, the nominal number for GDP in terms of a expected expected continual increase in GDP over this 20-year period. So you'll see at times we're over that number, at times we're under it. So we see progressive growth throughout the 1920s until you get kind of a peak here in about 1929. Then you see that quick drop off and then the lower drop. Like I said, the lowest point of the Depression is in early 1933. Okay, so for this whole period, roughly from 1930 to 1937, the country is well below expected economic growth, right? Again, this is what it should be. This is what it is. We bump back over that in 1937 or 1936, 37. It dips back below it in 1937, 38, the so-called Roosevelt recession. And then as we start ramping up production for World War II, you see it shoot up, and it continues to grow up after that point. So just to give you an idea of how bad the economy got during these years. So let's talk a little bit about how we get the whole New Deal started and what Roosevelt did to make this happen. Okay? Um, so things had always been in the past that when there was the presidential election in November of the even numbered year, the interregnum period lasted, and the interregnum is the period from the election until the transfer of power, until the new president takes over. And it had always been from November until March of the following year. Obviously, now it's in January. Now, the reason for that is because, when the Constitution was established and all these rules were made, it took a longer time to do things. It took time for a new president to travel from wherever they were from to D.C., and all the other things that needed to happen. It also took a significant amount of time to tally up the election totals, usually at least about a month's time before the results were announced. And this is a very difficult period for Roosevelt because he has all these plans and all these ideas for things he wants to do as president, but he's not president for this 4-month span. And during that 4-month span in early 1933, we get the collapse of the banking system. The American banking system totally collapses. When I told you last chapter is how as many as 11,000 banks in the United States closed during the Great Depression. This is kind of that time period when the bank runs happen. A lot of these banks shut down. So Roosevelt can't do anything. Herbert Hoover is very bitter about losing the election and everybody's blaming him and all that stuff. And probably shouldn't have sent the troops on the veterans at the bonus army, thinking maybe, who knows. But in any event, there's this long period where very little can be done. Ultimately, what results is a change in the Constitution with the 20th Amendment that moved the inauguration up 6 weeks to late January, where it is now, and shortening that interregnum period so a new administration can take over from a lame duck one. Okay? When Roosevelt becomes president, he immediately sets out to restore people's confidence in our economic systems. Okay? Roosevelt establishes himself as president by being the first president to outline what he's going to do in what we refer to now as the 100 days. We're amidst the 100 days right now for President Biden, so you hear that talked about a lot on the news. The 100 days, the first 100 days of a new president's time in office is when they're really supposed to implement and take action all the plans and goals and policies, or at least a lot of them, that they had promised or attempted or had talked about while they were running for office. Okay, and of course Roosevelt, who has people very confident. Roosevelt's a very confident guy. He possesses a lot of this demeanor that encourages a lot of people. And when Roosevelt takes over, he immediately goes after fixing this troubled banking system. Okay, so one of the first things he does is declares a bank holiday, basically immediately shutting down all the banks in the United States. By this time, 9 to 11,000 of them had closed. He figures, okay, to stop more banks from closing, we got to shut them all down, meaning people can't take money out, they can't put money in, the banks are closed. Okay, and that is what the bank holiday was all about. Okay, just let everybody just relax, take a deep breath, and let's take a look at this bank situation. He then goes out and passes the Emergency Banking Act, which essentially gets together a group of Treasury officials that are going to go from bank to bank and kind of inspect them to make sure that they are sound and not about to go out of business. Okay, and not until all these banks are kind of approved by the Treasury Department are they allowed to reopen. So the bank holidays were as short as 3 days, and other ones could last for much longer. Okay, this is all an effort to get people to stop taking their money out of the banks and destroying our banking system, and letting everybody just take a breath. And Roosevelt here kind of convincing people that, like, I got an answer for this. I got this covered. Don't worry. He then goes ahead and creates the Glass-Steagall Act, or promotes the Glass-Steagall Act, which results in the creation of the FDIC. The FDIC is a very important federal program. It's the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and that is something that is still around today. Whenever you go to a bank nowadays, you should see a plaque there that says member of the FDIC, basically meaning that the federal government insures deposits in that bank. Initially, it was up to $5,000. So in other words, any bank account up to $5,000, if that bank closes, your money's covered. The federal government will cover up to $5,000. Now, the amount is $250,000. Your money in the bank is covered up to $250,000 through the Glass-Steagall Act, through the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This is one of the first programs of the New Deal. Of course, it's still around today, and it's a successful program. Another program that's created is the Securities and Exchange Commission. Basically, the role of the Securities and Exchange Commission is to make sure that the actions and activities of Wall Street, of the stock market, are fair and equitable for people. In other words, the job of the Securities and Exchange Commission is to police the stock market. Make sure that there's not traders on there that are giving people bad information and stuff like that. If you ever hear of like insider trading or violations, it's usually the Securities Exchange Commission that kind of go after that. If you've ever seen the film The Wolf of Wall Street, the people that ultimately arrest Jordan Belfort, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, are agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission because he was, selling, bad stocks to people essentially, and telling them they're worth a lot more than they are and making a killing on that. And you're not allowed to do that. Securities Exchange Commission probably got involved with the whole GameStop thing in the last couple of weeks, investigating it to kind of make sure that questionable practices within the market are limited. All of these programs, all of these things come together to, again, restore people's confidence in our banking system. That it's not restored overnight. It's not, it doesn't happen like that. But Roosevelt immediately sets to take these, to take these different programs and use them to say, look, again, I'm going to do something about our circumstances. You can trust me. It's a new day in America. I'm the new president, and we're going to make good things happen by fixing these systems that don't work. So largely, all four, I guess emergency banking. So all three of these are successful programs and successful plans, and at least for a time, people's kind of confidence is restored in, or is at least in the process of getting restored to help, people financially and get everybody back on track. So now, much of what the New Deal does, and we'll talk about a lot of it throughout this chapter, much of what the New Deal does is pretty good and pretty successful, though not each and every program of the New Deal is met with a great deal of success. There are some programs that don't work, and this is going to create problems for Roosevelt down the line. One of these examples of a program that doesn't work is the Agricultural Adjustment Act. So, of course, we're talking about farmers again. Basically, farm prices are extremely low as farmers continue to produce more and more and more and more and more and more farm goods, crops and such, thinking that will make them more money. So with farm prices depressed, the government passes the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which basically pays farmers not to grow crops. Basically saying, we will give you money, we will give you checks, we will give you money not to plant more crops. The idea is this will lessen up the supply and it will drive crop prices back up. Unfortunately, a lot of the farmers take the money that they get from the government to not plant crops and plant crops. So it actually does nothing to kind of help the price of farm goods. And furthermore, this is one of a couple of Roosevelt's programs that are declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Why is it declared unconstitutional? Because the federal government doesn't have the right to tell, private citizens or farmers or whoever what they can and cannot do with federal funding or what they can and cannot do with money. You can't tell them they're not allowed to plant crops. So, one, this fails because the farmers don't do the right thing with it. They just plant more crops. It also fails because it's an unconstitutional program with the government instituting too many controls and oversights over individual businesses or farmers or whatever. This is going to be a problem for Roosevelt. Roosevelt is going to run into a fair amount of opposition from Republicans in Congress who fear, and rightfully so, that many of these programs are creating too much of a socialistic government environment in the United States. That is not something that we want at all, and that certainly is something that these people in Congress, Republicans, want to prevent from happening. Another example of a failed program is the National Industrial Recovery Act, which establishes about here, which establishes the National Recovery Administration. Now, the National Recovery Administration, the book doesn't really, it kind of over-explains it. Basically, the National Recovery Administration was this very large program that was in charge of distributing money to states, like grant money and things like that, for various programs. It was in charge of setting up programs to kind of like build new buildings and other like infrastructure projects. It's a very large, overarching system. The problem with the NRA is the fact that it is so large. Okay, the National Recovery Administration is basically in charge of so many different things that it's able to accomplish very little. Okay, and what it does is establishes all these different like codes and requirements for things that put a lot of limits on the states in terms of not only what they can do with federal funding, but also what they can do with their own money. And ultimately, the National Industrial Recovery Act is also declared unconstitutional because, kind of for the same reason as the Agricultural Adjustment Act, it is giving the government way too much power to determine what people can and cannot do with their money. And that's what I really want you to understand about NERA, because again, the book goes into so much detail with it, but it's really, what you really need to know is between the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the National Industrial Recovery Act, is there two New Deal programs that were declared unconstitutional, and they essentially they essentially attempt to increase the power of the federal government more than a lot of people are comfortable with. And that's why NERA is a failure. Okay? Giving the federal government too much control over what individual businesses do in states, just like it gives too much power to the federal government in telling farmers what they can and cannot do with their money. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense. And of course, we'll talk about it a little bit more in class. So let's get into a couple other kind of New Deal programs that were pretty prominent here. For one, and one of the kind of most celebrated programs and most successful of the entire New Deal was the Tennessee Valley Authority. Okay, now the Tennessee Valley is actually an area that encompasses about 4 or 5 different states, but they happen to be one of the poorest regions in the country because the land isn't very good, because there's lots of flooding and stuff like that. So the Tennessee Valley Authority's job was basically to create dams and power plants to kind of harness the opportunities for hydroelectric power in the region. And it does a really, really good job of expanding, it does a really good job of making the region more inhabitable for people and more profitable, even though it still remains a very poor area, still one of the poorer areas of the country, but much better off after they start damming the different rivers and things like that. They build a bunch of dams on all these rivers in the Tennessee Valley, prevent flooding, and then provide electricity to people that had never had electricity before in regions in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, North Carolina, and Virginia. Okay, so lots of different states are affected here, and the Tennessee Valley Authority does a really good job of putting people to work and kind of fixing an area and helping an area that before had been really downtrodden and in a bad position. Other programs that are created include FERA, okay, which is the Federal Emergency Relief Act. This is another program that provides. There's another program that provides grants to states to invest in various projects. So, all kinds of money that would go to help, um, you know, would go to help the different states with their various relief efforts and agencies that are either not doing so well or needed more money to be able to accomplish more projects. Uh, this also leads to the creation of the Civilian Conservation Corps. The Civilian Conservation Corps is one of the great successes of the New Deal, and it created about 4 million jobs, I believe, mostly for young men working in national parks, doing things like, planting trees, building reservoirs, cleaning areas up, mostly in public spaces. Uh, the people were paid low wages. You made low wages, but your room and board was paid, and it created for young men in particular, it was mostly men, mostly white men that were in the Civilian Conservation Corps, an opportunity to really grow personally and get job skills and experience that they could use later on in life. The Civilian Conservation Corps ended up creating a lot of new and different public parks around the country, helped clean up and beautify these parks and other places, and ultimately, helped improve our national park system as well. It gave young men confidence. It provided them with a little bit of money, some practical work experience and job training, and helped prepare them for future success. A program that exists today that is kind of like the descendant of the Civilian Conservation Corps is AmeriCorps, which is involved in a lot of different programs around the country and world. In fact, I was a member of AmeriCorps for 2 years, my first 2 years as a teacher. So really good programs, really great opportunities, and great legacies here from Roosevelt, at least in regards to these programs. In setting up, what we're seeing happen is all kinds of different programs being established in all kinds of different parts of the country with different socioeconomic backgrounds, with different, racial backgrounds, and with different racial and ethnic backgrounds in places, showing us that the New Deal is going to be something that is applicable and useful for all Americans, not just white Americans, not just men, not just women, but minorities and other people alike. It's also marketed very well. They market and this is to finish for today, they market the New Deal basically calling it the 3 R's. Like we have reading, writing, and arithmetic for learning. The 3 R's to the New Deal are relief, reform, and recovery, right? All the programs and plans in the New Deal were meant to either provide one or, if not all, of these different outcomes to the American people, either financial relief through jobs or something like that, reform by changing the banking system, recovery by, again, providing jobs for people, or putting more confidence and trust into our, various institutions in this country. Roosevelt does a really good job with this. He faces some challenges, and there's a lot more where that came from, and we'll get into that a little bit next time. Okay. Again, there's just a map of the Tennessee Valley Authority, so you see it's a vast area that the Tennessee Valley encompasses, and we built a lot of dams and a lot of power plants in a lot of places all over the valley here, and it really helps to really change the lives for a really strong number of people in these regions. in this region of the Tennessee Valley. So that's all I got this time. We will see you next time. The Michael Mobley apology count currently stands at 17. See ya.